You joining us here today to celebrate Earth Day and to celebrate just the Earth in general with these renowned speakers and authors. So I'd like to start by talking about Hazel, and I actually work for Synergetic Press, and we've been working on Hazel's book. So Tomi Hazel Vaarde has been advising farms, stewarding forests, and teaching environmental sciences for more than 50 years. And they have been instrumental in teaching and spreading permaculture practices over the last 37 years, primarily in Southern Oregon and Northern California. They've been a guest teacher with other renowned educators such as Bill Mollison, Welcome to the Eco Grief panel with Starhawk and Hazel. We really appreciate you joining us here today to celebrate Earth Day and to celebrate just the Earth in general with these renowned speakers and authors. So I'd like to start by talking about Hazel, and I actually work for Synergetic Press, and we've been working on Hazel's book. So Tomi Hazel Vaarde has been advising farms, stewarding forests, and teaching environmental sciences for more than 50 years. And they have been instrumental in teaching and spreading permaculture practices over the last 37 years, primarily in Southern Oregon and Northern California. They've been a guest teacher with other renowned educators such as Bill Mollison, Toby Hemingway, and Starhawk, and is a colleague of Siskiyou Permaculture Organization. And I've also invited Starhawk today because she is an amazing author and person, and she is the activist and permaculture designer and teacher, as well as a prominent voice in modern earth-based spirituality and ecofeminism. She's the author and co-author of 13 books, including The Spiral Dance, A Rebirth of the Ancient Religion of the Great Goddess, and the ecotopia novel, The Fifth Sacred Thing, and its sequel, City of Refuge. She is the co-founder and director of Earth Activist Training. And so this topic I chose because it's really deep to my heart. I personally, my name's Chloe Bazada, and I've been working in the eco movement for the last 10 years. I mean, it's not much compared to the elders that are here that I look up to. But I've been working in the eco village sphere and also now the eco marketing coordinator for Synergetic Press. And I think that it's important to capture these types of conversations because our future is at stake, and there's a lot of hope that's needed in these spaces. And I really think that Hazel and Starhawk have really cultivated that throughout their years. So really honored to have you both here, and let's jump in. One of the most powerful parallels of your work is the ability to use storytelling as a catalyst for change and inspiration. What inspires your use of storytelling? This question is for both of you, so I'd like to hear. Why don't we go with Starhawk first?
I feel like stories are a very powerful way to reach people. You know, as humans, we respond to story more than we respond to a list of facts or, an outline of policies, because story engages more of our whole self. In my earth-based tradition, we like to think that we have sort of a tripartite self, that there's the talking self, which is your intellectual part, your part that uses words, that thinks about concepts and abstracts. And then there's your younger self, which is the part that responds more to sensation, to color, to emotion, to smells and touch and taste. And it's that younger self that engages our emotions and actually engages our deep self, that part of us that transcends personality and transcends lifetime and connects most deeply to the spirit in everything. And stories engage younger self. They are emotional. There's something we feel, not just something we think about. Stories are also a great way for me. You know, I've written a couple of novels that are set in the future and that are sort of speculative fiction. And for me, that's a great way to engage with questions that don't lend themselves to easy answers. You know, if I actually know something, right, you know, I can tell you how to do something, or I think I know something, I'll write nonfiction. But if I'm writing fiction or writing a story, it's a chance to wrestle with a question like the one at the heart of my novel, The Fifth Sacred Thing, is really how does a peaceful culture respond to violence without becoming what you're fighting against? Is it possible to resist violence and cruelty without becoming that yourself? And I don't think there's a clear, easy answer to that. Uh, you know, in City of Refuge, its sequel, I was more wrestling with the question of how do we create the new world?
Well,
through time, but is linked. It has threads that hold it together. And I really liked what Starhawk said about the child, the young mind, because I'm a fan of Paul Shepard and Nature and Madness, where he points out that if we don't have a childhood wild in nature with all of the stings and bruises and slime and rashes and then we don't actually get a symbolic repertoire because we don't think in words. We think symbolically. It's symbolic logic. And so stories done right are more like dreams.
mm,
And if you're really good at it, you're using natural metaphors and you're connecting with nature or you're connecting with that child, and thus you can work a multidimensional magic of tying things together, and that is awesome for the listener who sits there and just melts into it, just relaxes into this orchestra.
that's great. And I'm also curious because I think you've even referred to yourself as a trickster when it comes to storytelling. So what does that mean to you? And also how do you use that in your book?
So a trickster triggers, I'm going to use that term again, which we may return to in a different context, but it tickles. And so a trickster is funny, serious. There it is, between two worlds. And I've always felt like an in between, and I am an in between, and that makes me a trickster. So don't believe a word I say. Well, the last chapter of my book, perhaps influenced a bit by Starhawk, is is a futurology. It's a vision. It's a vision of another life that is unimaginable now.
Mm.
But that I say we need vision first and foremost before we can do anything else. And I want to talk quickly about that. My new structure, having being on the edge of permaculture and not quite in it, like step. I'm actually considering social forestry. I mean, excuse me, permaculture to be a tool of social forestry.
Mm.
So I've taken permaculture and put it over there, and I go with quick fix, retrofit, and ultimate. And I think that without the vision of ultimate, without understanding a wholeness, a whole world, a completeness, a possibility, a goal, we're going to make mistakes with our quick fixes and our retrofits. And certainly permaculture is the queen of retrofit. And all of us need to recognize what quick fixes we can do that fit within ultimate, that do not compromise ultimate.
I love that. Thank you, Hazel. So, and I think it leads well into our next question. As elders who have made profound contributions to the permaculture movement through your time of activism, what are some of the biggest changes you have seen in the permaculture movement and the wider sustainability movement? And before launching in, I would like to say, yeah, permaculture seems a little outdated now, that term. So I'm curious what you have to say with the reference you just had. Starhawk, we can go with you again.
Yeah, I like to think what we do, it's permaculture, but it's also part of the sort of, you could say, larger regenerative movement around regenerating land and ecosystems. And permaculture is a really powerful tool for that. Social forestry and permaculture and holistic management, grazing and agroforestry and agroecology and all those things are like overlapping Venn diagrams that have some differences, but a lot of common goals and intentions and approaches. Um, I really like, Tom, I have to say, I heard you speak years ago at a conference, and what I really loved was you were talking about fairy tales. And we'd been working with fairy tales for decades as like magical patterns and keys to ritual and keys to self-development and ways in which some of the old pagan traditions got encoded after Christianity came in. But I had never thought of them as being sort of practical guides to how people manage the forest until I heard you speak. And I really, really love that. I found that really inspiring and fascinating. I think I've wandered far from your question. So what was that again?
That's okay. No, I think what I'd love to hear more about from both of you is the fact that you are, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but both of you are activists in essence, and that you've been in the movement for so long. Like, how has it shifted, and how have you contributed to it?
Well, I think one of the things I've brought and other people have brought, particularly some of the women in permaculture, is more of a focus on the social permaculture.
Mhm.
Um, the part about the ethics of care for the earth, care for the people, care for the future, like
Mhm.
the care for the people part, is maybe more in the forefront than it was for Bill and David and some of the founders. And I think it's also because over the years, what I've often seen is that it's the people part that is our true constraining factor. You know, the trees and the vegetables and the animals are relatively easy to deal with, but the people are always the challenge. And so I've spent a lot of my focus on, how do we design systems that can help people interact in beneficial ways? And how do we resolve conflicts in groups? because believe me, if you have conflicts about anything, as soon as you get out there in the woods and you're talking about what you're going to do with those forests, you're going to have different ideas of how to do it and what works and what doesn't work. Um, that pets, money, and how to raise your kids are right, some of the most challenging things for groups and communities to deal with. And a lot of people in the permaculture, back to the land regenerative movement, love the idea of community and love the idea of intentional communities and stuff, and then go out there. And what they don't realize is that living together in community is one of the most difficult and challenging things we ever attempt to do as humans. To me, that's the great challenge in permaculture. And it goes with some of the work we've done in earth activist training has really been around how do we actually bring more human diversity into the movement. I remember going to a convergence maybe 15 years ago with my friend Pandora Thomas, who's a wonderful permaculture designer and teacher and farmer now with a beautiful new farm called Earthseed here in Sonoma County, founder of the Black permaculture movement. We were looking around, and really, she was the only Black person there. There was one other woman who was indigenous. Everybody else was white, and we are like, what do we do about this?
Yeah.
Um, and we did a skit in the talent show about it. It was, all we could do was like laugh or cry. Right? But in Earth Activist training, we began doing support for a local group in inner city San Francisco and helping them with some of the community gardens that they were tending in Bayview Hunters Point. We began offering diversity scholarships for Indigenous folks and people of color, and mentoring teachers and mentoring people, and really making that a focus and an intention. And I think it has made a tremendous difference. I remember one of the last convergences before COVID shut everything down, looking around, and people of color were everywhere. There was really a beautiful diversity within the movement. And I'm certainly not saying we did all of that, but I will say that as I looked around, I saw person after person after person that had come through our groups or our trainings. And that made me feel really proud of the work that we've done. I think permaculture and the regenerative ag movement on the whole needs to constantly keep in mind that to regenerate the ecosystem, we have to base that in justice because otherwise it doesn't work, right? You don't have a forest where, 2 or 3 trees grab all the nutrients and the rest starve, right? That does not sustain itself. And we can't have a social or an economic system unless it's built on real sustainability, and that means equity. And that means taking a look at the real history of what's gone on in the world, and why systems are unequal as they are now. And as Hazel was saying, having that vision of the ultimate, making sure our vision includes a diverse world, and then saying, how do we get there?
Yeah. You were answering my questions as they were popping up in my head around representation was a big question I had for you, because it's also a trend that I have noticed or hoping to notice more and more. Yeah, because when you use the word permaculture as it stands, at least today or the last 30 years, it has been made by white men. And so there's been a lot of scrutiny, especially after the Black Lives Matter movement has picked up more and more around that the white men took it and ran with it. And so I was curious about representation and the piece that you played in it. And I know, Hazel, also you do also talk about that a lot, especially as far as Indigenous people go. And so I just wanted to hear your take on that. And also, I was curious about the social sphere as far as doing this work, because as I've worked with other elders in the eco village movement, the permaculture movement, I'm getting paid for this work. Like, I can say I'm getting paid for this work, and I know that's because I've been working on the backs of other elders. So I'm curious, would you also say that it's easier to do this work, or maybe not easier, but like I'm curious that before versus now as far as doing activism work?
Well, my, what a story we're telling here. So my people have been working on justice issues for 500 years, and we've gone through a lot. And the Hicksite Quakers, the most recent branch that I come from, and we've made a lot of mistakes. And I'm hoping to bring that thread of practicality in. I mean, one of the first things I want to say before I launch into 8 other things is what about the work? So far, everyone wants to talk and they want to discuss. And I actually consider that to be procrastination, not actually digging in, not actually being practical within proper contexts. So it takes community to do some of the things. And I'm afraid back in the day when Uncle Bill, that's what I call Bill Mollison, when Uncle Bill came marching in his sergeant-like way, he was playing the same game that the Quakers played ineffectively, which is, we need to change the world. Let's petition the government. Let's make a movement. Let's cause things to change on the highest level possible, so as to have act and to help the most people. And that turned out to be easily gamed by lobbyists and other people who were in the capitalist commercial strain. So let me try to thread that. When I first started with permaculture and when I first came of age, the thing to do was fight in the streets. It was to demonstrate. It was to stop things. And my generation did a big thing. And then they became yuppies. They fell right into the same commercial, consumerist, soft living trap we've all been hypnotized with. So I want to say empire is collapsing and relocalization and decentralization is inevitable. And how do we deal with that? It isn't pretty, but it has to be done based on place, I believe, because of all the different cultures I've dealt with. When you have place, it helps you figure out how to be a people of place. So it's a big thing to say, but I have some clues, of how to do that. It's not easy. And I'm afraid it does require a lot of that social structure that Starhawk was talking about at the end, about how moderns don't want to give up their freedoms. But I want to point out that freedom is a complete construct put together for commercial purposes. It is a line of blank blank. And instead, we should be talking about liberty, because liberty is the ability of a people of place to make their own decisions. And freedom doesn't exist I want to claim that no one person, especially me, has the truth. Only through an interaction with multiple entities can we even start to approach the truth. And that I think we get to later in the last few questions. So I'll hold
Yes.
back on that a little bit. Um, so we have seen this decentralization and relocalization theme come through permaculture and come through other movements. One of the first things that happened to permaculture was that it got taken over and given other names and monetarized. In fact, the Australians were very askance at what was happening in America, which they saw as a consumer franchise, permaculture as a gig, as a way to make a living. And the Australians were still in this idea that all we need to do is lobby the proper authorities and we can get a few things changed and the world will be better. Didn't go so well, did it? So we're watching a complete rearrangement of so many things. I want to go sideways on so many subjects. I want to have a whole set of posters up. I want us to be meeting in a cathedral of sacred trees. I want us in this cathedral where we can point at symbols and we can like tie things together and weave narratives through. This is the work, and I think it happens in drainage basin councils. That's ultimate relocalization. Right now, our political boundaries are ridiculous. How do you govern with these boundaries? It's stupid. So I have to watch out. I can't use certain words because they're not socially acceptable and they interfere with justice. But I'll use that one. So we can only do the type of thinking and the type of social arrangement and the type of cooperation and collegiology through a spiritual, natural, place-based, cultural, and somewhat stringent social structure, so that we can actually make time. We used to have these social movements back in the 60s against Vietnam, the first Earth Day, which we're celebrating still here, and we didn't have to deal with what I'm dealing with now, which is interrupters, people who come in and stir things up for reasons that are not clear. And we used to, during the 80s, blame it on coentropole. We blamed it on infiltration. But now disruption has become kind of a game, kind of a gig. And that disruption has been profoundly difficult to deal with. Usually my Quaker trick is put the disruptor on a committee and give them an assignment and tell them to come back later and with a report, okay? And then we'll be better able to deal with their concern. That used to work. Now I can't tell the difference between a trained intelligence officer disruptor and a plain old crazy person who's been hypnotized by consumerism, empire, nationalism, racism. All these things are constructs, that these isms that I was talking about. And I'm afraid permaculture is in that basket. It's a movement. And we need to be with that movement in a grounded way, in a centered and grounded way. And thus I talking relocalization and decentralization. And I want to claim, and I agree with Starhawk, Indigenous people do things that appear to limit individuality. I call it hyper individuality. And instead, when you come into community, when you come into loving community and you start working and things happen And love emerges as an emergent property of complexity. But that complexity is held in social construct, and everyone needs to know the same set of stories and have a full deck of cards in their symbolic logic so that we can actually talk to each other and understand each other. And that's where some selective centering may be necessary. And in Quakers, it's a long membership process. You go through clearness committee, you meet with the elders. We don't bring you into unanimous consent and decision making until we have come into spiritual community with you. Because otherwise, we have seen it not work. So this is a big challenge because we're dealing with this Orwellian world. However, here I am. I'm here to report. My culture did not die. We have watched this whole thing happen, and we have a message for you. Dig in, step up. This is real. And you're dealing with horrendous idiocy. That's an entity. I didn't call anyone an idiot. It's another ism. But this is tough. And we need to get real. Mm. And I think the first thing to do to get real is bump up your nature deficit disorder. Mm.
I love that. And that's a hard stop, as we say. And I like what you guys are talking about. I think it's really important, and that's why I want to go to the next piece, because I think what's really important in this space is to speak to not only my generation but younger people. I'm 30, about 30 years old, and I feel like there's so much on our shoulders, yet there's so much we haven't learned how to deal with. And so that's why I really want to hear both of your perspectives on this. And so one of the themes I've noticed in your work is the ability to hold space for eco grief. And as one of the biggest traumas of our generation, what words of advice could you offer of the grieving change and mass extinctions? And even to go an extra step, what's the change that you're expecting or wanting of us? I think Hazel just said some of that. Hazel, we can stay on you.
Grief is an immediate feeling. It's a feeling. It's a way of being, in a way. And although I have some questions about Martin Prechtel, I like his combination of praise and grief. So whenever you're grieving, you're actually praising because you feel like you're losing something you love. So whenever we grieve, we should remember the love in there. And secondly, when we grieve, we shouldn't complain or be cynical, because both of those is stepping out of the circle. It'd be better to tell a story of grief that's inclusive. When you grieve in community and you feel it together, there's some relief. When you grieve by yourself, you feel lost. You don't have the holding that a community can give you. You don't have the mechanisms that are traditional for dealing with loss and for dealing with grief. And so grief becomes a trigger. There I go again. It tickles you into behaviors that are not healthy. And those grief-driven behaviors is kind of the nature of modernity, fragmentation and alienation. Now, trauma can be different. It can be cultural trauma. And all of us carry cultural trauma because all of our ancestors were deracinated. Their villages were destroyed. They were driven into armies or into cities and factories. All of us, in our language, in our rock and roll, in our drugs, in our consumerism. This is a nice soft pillow I'm sitting on. Good thing, because I'm on a Zoom call. So we can actually help with cultural trauma by putting a narrative together, a string that goes back to our ancestors and shows us that our ancestors were actually pretty cool. Some of them. So why don't we work on that cultural trauma? Because it's leading us to misbehavior that
Hmm.
is not helpful when it comes to the work. And let's work with our grief, our immediate grief. If we're on our own, I mean it, forest bathing, nature connection, that will help. And certainly all the things that my team talks about, of weeping and running and jumping and screaming and whatever. But let's be careful. We'll all do a lot better if we can hold our trauma and our grief in a story, that supports culture of place.
I feel like I have a lot more questions to ask around it, but I'm gonna hold it because I really want to hear Starhawk as well.
Well, my mother was a therapist and she was an expert in loss and grief. She wrote a book about it called A Time to Mourn. And my father died when I was 5 and left her with me and my little brother, who was only 9 months old. And she took her grief and turned it into work of helping others to move through their grief. And she always was very clear that grief is a process. It has many stages. A lot of people are familiar with Kubler-Ross and the stages around death. But, with grief, there's denial and there's anger and there's bargaining, trying to, dear God, if you just like give me back my lost dog, I will never skip church again, kind of, right? Um, there's often searching. You lose your life partner, and then for the next year, you're driven nuts because you're constantly losing your car keys and losing your wallet and losing your cell phone. But it's almost like a way of allowing yourself to constantly reenact that grief and loss, and then that finding, that restoring, that restitution of what was lost. And I think we can look at that in terms of what goes on around the climate. I mean, the big response to climate change, from so many people was denial, right? We'll deal with it by not dealing with it. It's not happening. We're just not going to admit it's happening. And then anger and rage, how dare you tell us we have to change our ways? Um, ultimately you have to be able to get to the sadness and allow yourself to experience that and not be afraid of it and not run from it, and really, like with a personal loss, yeah, you need to just sit down, cry your eyes out for a while. And when you do, like, you may feel when you're in the middle of it, like you're never going to stop crying and it's never going to feel better. But in the end, it does. It shifts, it passes. It's like a wave that comes through. And on the other side of it, you find that there are gifts, even in grief and loss. One of the gifts is the opening of the heart and of compassion. One of the gifts Hazel was saying is that it is a mark of your love for someone or something. It's one of the ways we express love is through grief, through the sadness when something is lost. And it opens up the possibility of something else coming in that can restore, maybe not the lost loved one, but restore some of your happiness, some of your ability to live a full and a rich and an engaged life. But you can't always short circuit that process, by avoiding the difficult parts.
Mm.
And I think traditional cultures have a way, my own ancestral culture is Jewish. And in Jewish culture, when somebody dies, you sit Shiva. You take a week and um, you cover the mirrors in the house and you sit on the ground. You don't sit on chairs and you don't change your clothes. You don't bathe. You don't shave. Um, People bring you food and you just let yourself grieve and come to terms with the loss in the morning. Um, you know, Today in this modern culture, somebody's life partner dies and they're expected to show up at work the next day, and function. And um, we don't work like that as human beings. We need to be able to take that time to express and to feel our grief. And I think with climate change, the grief is potentially so overwhelming that it's frightening to allow yourself to feel it. But if you don't feel it, it becomes depression. It often turns inward. I was listening to a podcast just yesterday with a writer named Andrew Solomon, who's a psychiatrist, and he works with young people, and he's writing a book on the suicide of young people. And he said something that was really interesting. He said, when they look at why young people commit suicide, it's actually not so much about bullying. It's not so much about, low self-esteem. It's not so much about TikTok, whatever. It's about this feeling that the world is so damaged and that they're never going to have a good life in it, that the climate is so hopeless, that they're going to have to experience these tremendous disruptions that we keep predicting, that people keep not listening to, that they're never going to be, that whatever situation they're in, they're never going to be able to get out of it, because that ability to improve your life, to improve your circumstances just isn't happening now the way that it was. And that really, really struck me, because we tend to think of climate grief as something a little more removed and a little more abstract. But I think for a lot of young people, it's not. It's very, very present. And they don't necessarily have the perspective of a long life to look back and say, well, yeah, in the 70s, we were sure it was nuclear war and it was all going to end when Reagan got elected. And Reagan was not good, but here we are, we're still here, right?
Yeah.
So that only kind of comes from living and weathering some stuff. So I think we have to be able to address that climate grief. And I think for young people, it's important. And that's where I think permaculture, social forestry, regenerative approaches really offer something, because they offer concrete things you can actually do
Mm.
that make the situation better. And I think that's really important for young people to have some hope and to be able to kind of come through that grief and say, okay, well, I can't fix it all. We may be doomed, but, I can work on this prescribed burn here on this forest and make it a little more likely that this home will survive. The last couple of years over the pandemic, I think has taught us a lot about making the best of a bad situation. And that making the best of a bad situation is a whole lot better than not making the best of it. Things can come out of it, and um, it's certainly better than making the worst out of a bad situation. I know out here we started organizing around the forests, with the pandemic and with the major, major wildfires we've had in the years leading up to it. And even the first year of the pandemic, we had two major wildfires on either side of us here and were evacuated. And lots and lots of people have lost homes. Our Santa Rosa, our nearest big city, burned in 2017 from a wildfire that came in. It actually started the night the permaculture convergence ended and moved so quickly that it went into the city itself. All these climate driven disasters. And one young woman, Angie Cooper, actually, she's not that young, but she seems young to me, right? She just said at one point, hey, we should get the community together. We should start working on our roadsides and our access, and we should start just doing this stuff. We can apply for grants, we can do that, but let's just do it. And she started putting the word out, and people came. And for every Saturday over the last, I think we're now in our third year, the community has gotten together, 10 people, sometimes 30 people, and worked on the thinning and the pruning and the limbing up and the pile burns and at times now the prescribed burns, all the stuff that Hazel talks about in your book, to try to make our land a little bit safer in the face of fire. And, on the one hand, you kind of go, in a huge climate driven wildfire, it may be that nothing we do makes any difference, but it might, it might make this land much, much safer. And it's not just happening here. I hear people talking about this all over California, all over the West, communities getting together. And as Hazel was saying, you realize this is, I think it's one of the fire's great teachings, that it is about community. You can't fight a wildfire alone, and you can't, you can't prevent a wildfire. You can't build resilience alone. You have to do that together. You have to do that in community. I also wanted to share a couple things. A little story. I was at Standing Rock when they were having the big protests there. And I've spent a lot of my time doing protests. I think protest is important, that stopping the bad stuff. It has to be done. I think of change as like an ecosystem, and it's one of the niches that have to be filled. But it also is hard, and it takes it out of you over time, and it's good to balance it with the stuff like the regeneration and the restoration that we do. But anyway, I was at Standing Rock only for a very short time, but as part of that time, I was invited to join a women's sweat that was poured by a beautiful woman named Lila June, who's an amazing singer and songwriter and teacher. And I went up there, it was early in the morning, it was freezing cold, it was much earlier than I usually get up. I was sitting there waiting to go in, and I looked at her, and she was wearing a t-shirt that said Boudica. And Boudica was a Celtic warrior, and she was like the chieftainess of her tribe, and her daughters were raped by the Romans, and she was livid and furious and led an uprising that almost succeeded in driving them out of Britain. And Lila June put us in the sweat lodge and was pouring the sweat, and she started to talk about the witch persecutions. And I was just amazed because I had spent a lot of my life writing and thinking about the witch persecutions and the way that they represented misogyny, the way that they represented driving a wedge between people of place and
Mm,
their ancient traditions and laws and culture, and turning people against one another, making people suspicious of their own healers and their own earth-based connection traditions, and calling them evil and devil worship, as a way to consolidate the power of the church and ultimately to consolidate the power of that rising capitalist system. Um, and so here was this beautiful indigenous woman who had recently been discovering the European side of her heritage and recognizing that there were also indigenous roots
mm,
on that side. They were just further back and they were severed, by this horrific persecution that happened. And I really got the message that said, white people need to know about the witch burnings or they can't heal.
mm,
And it really made me think about this upsurge we have of this toxic white supremacy and this victimization and, these people who actually hold more power in the system than anyone else, who are so convinced that they're the victims and they're powerless, and recognizing it and saying, maybe a piece of that goes to the unresolved grief of the immigrant, the things we left behind, the ways that we have lost. As Hazel was saying, we've been separated from our cultures and our backgrounds, and um, it doesn't justify, right, that kind of toxic hatred.
mm.
Uh, but it might give an in into saying, well, can we acknowledge that, as you were saying, Hazel, we go back far enough, we all have victims in our cultural line. We all have horrific things. We all have losses that never were grieved. And the saddest thing is the way that we then enact those same kinds of damage on other people, um, instead of being able to face that pain, go through it, and allow it to open us up and make us more compassionate and more connected.
Thank you, Starhawk. I think what I'd like to share on this topic, you both have brought so much, and just speaking again from my generational view, I totally resonated with what you said around that young people are feeling it maybe arguably the most because we have to, and younger people than me have to deal with it more and more, and it's so hard to claim that grief because no one's telling you that it's relatable, that other people are feeling too, and they make it so isolating as if it's only happening to you and that it's not about the earth, it's about your own detriment. um, and being in this sphere, learning about permaculture, and I would argue that permaculture is a channel, like, as we're sharing, it's a tool. And for me it was a channel of being like, oh well, I actually started in Greenpeace where there was a lot of stop this and stop that, and I realized, like, well, what happens when you stop that? That's a question I've been asking now for 10 years. What happens? And I'm encouraging other people to ask that too. And so I just wanted to share that, yes, permaculture is that channel, and it helps us, just especially as young people, but everyone, have an excuse to get back into nature and dig again. And Hazel, I do think that your book also encourages that greatly, that excuse. So I want to go there. What does the name social forestry come from?
So, social forestry, in my estimation, is a name for something that's been going on for a very long time. I say millions of years. Because in the archaeology, you don't find digging sticks, you don't find baskets, you don't find bundles of herbs. You find hunting tools, weapons. This is what's left in the ground. So my social forestry is a rebirth, if you will, a retake on social forestry. And I'm good with it because I was raised with social forestry and I went to forestry school and I have lots of jokes. I have lots of ranger jokes, lots. And so we need to get back to the woods, to the forest, back into relationship with the landscape. The landscape has been taken away for us. In fact, in Oregon, there's 1,000 Friends of Oregon that have made sure that zoning keeps people in cities and limits development so that large landscape scale destruction and extraction can continue full bore. So there's really mixed messages here in forestry. And I want to say, get the machines out of the forest, put the people back in. So that's social forestry. And some of the things I like to say are the trees miss us. The world, the real world, the natural world, they miss us. We're the humans. We can be useful. Did you know that? We can actually help out. And wow, that's amazing. And so people who come to our courses and to come play at my social forestry playground here, fully accessed amusement park, uh, have healings because they do something and they see useful results, and that helps. The other three things that I say in social forestry that humans are good for is number one, urinating, peeing. If you pee in the right place, it's an incredible gift. So that's kind of the best thing we do. And the next thing that we do that's really good is we're absolutely silly. We are the silliest species on the planet. We are ridiculous. What's this clothes thing? Oh yeah, clothes, jewelry. Oh yeah, we're the thing. And the third thing that we do, which is anthropological, is we make messes. We make lots of messes. But do you know what? There are good messes. They're called disturbance regimes. That's the digging stick. That's cultural fire. And then in this specific place, the little Applegate Canyon, and I would say all of Ecotopia of Cascadia, we have three icons in social forestry, and they are salmon, beaver, and cultural fire. And all three of those have to do with nutrient recycling. And essentially, I mean, globally, we're in such big trouble. We've dumped all these nutrients on used up farmland to produce food which is making us sick, which has very little nutrition in it. And then we're flushing all those nutrients down the river systems, and we've got these blooms in the oceans. And I mean, we're doing it wrong. And I all recommend Hicksite Quakers. We need to get back to organic farming in small holdings, in communities, in walking distance and buggy distance communities, bicycle distance communities, so that we can come together, but we can hold and do the work in place on the land. And that resettlement of humans in relationship to the land is profoundly subversive because it replaces consumerism. The forest itself and social forestry can provide all your needs if you reduce your needs, if you make life simple but elegant but gorgeous. And that's the promise I have. The very, very long promise of social forestry is to come back into our humanness, to come back into community and to get back to work as humans in nature and to accept feedback. I mean, we always give this crazy prayer before we light fire.